Jorge Padilla, Ariel Ezrachi, or Brook and myself are very honored to welcome you to our series Competition Exchange. It's the fourth episode. So our intention is to invite people who are known, we are known as very nuanced in your thinking and your academic and practical research. But you have reached the status and the level where you are not only yourself, but also representatives of the schools or archetypes. So we will be referring to you not only as thinkers or actors or academics, but also as uh, those who embody the trend, so to say. And while you are quite nuanced academically wise, so it would be difficult for us to extract some polarities, the schools which you are associated with are in very different poles, and thus it would be your task also to say something not only your personal, but also kind of in defense of the approach. Let us maybe start with inviting Or to frame the first block of questions, or maybe the first question.
So we start probably with the very straightforward question when it comes to both of you, and I think maybe also showing some of the initial approaches. So often we talk about competition policy and what it should be about. Should it be mostly about consumer welfare in an economic, relatively narrow definition? Should it take into account broader societal interest? And if so, how? And what should be the limits for that? Maybe Jorge, should we start with you?
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to share the time with both of you and with my dear friend Ariel. So look, as an economist, I'm going to defend consumer welfare. I'm going to defend long-run consumer welfare. It's not that I don't care about others' objectives from a society's perspective. And ultimately, I would say I would submit to whatever the citizenry wants to do. I think that it is not for us economists to choose goals. I think that what we need to make sure is that policies implement the goals that society establishes as efficiently as possible. But as an economist, I think that society has many objectives, many goals, but it also has many policies. And not every single policy is well suited to address each and every one of the goals of society. Competition policy is one among many macroeconomic policies that a society can deploy to achieve its broader goals. And it seems to me that, as the Nobel Prize winner Jean Timbergen said many times, if you have end goals, it's good to have end policies. One goal has to be to make sure that markets work efficiently. And that translates in economics in saying that markets need to meet the needs and desires of consumers in the long run. And if this is one of the goals, then it seems to me that competition policy is well suited to achieve that. And other goals can be achieved with other policies.
So before we go into the details, Ariel, do you want to tell us your approach?
So I think it's not a 0-1 scenario. So there is a spectrum. And probably we all agree that competition law cannot be encompassing everything, every single goal or element or policy concern that you have. But at the same time, competition law at the end is a social political construct. And different jurisdictions are using what we refer to as competition law to address concerns that they have that are relevant at the time of legislation, taking into account both the societal and economic reality. And because of that, when you look because we're asking about competition law, not about competition economics, when you look at the law around the world, you see that different legal regimes have a range of goals that they are promoting. This is just what it is. I'm not necessarily saying that it is an endless spectrum, but you see different competition agencies that will put forward more emphasis on, of course, efficiency or consumer welfare, while others integrate fairness or integrate elements that are a little bit wider. And some of us might feel more comfortable or less comfortable with all of them. So the starting point is that the construct that we're dealing with to begin with is quite flexible. Now, and of course, not to mention the European Union with the integration objective, but then you have the implementation. And for us to have workable technocratic excellence, we need to be able to quantify things. We need to turn them into workable benchmarks. And this is where de facto many competition agencies will gravitate on that spectrum towards something that is more workable. Often, this would mean that they would feel much more comfortable to be closer to the core DNA of what competition law is about and what Jorge is referring to, because this is workable. It also makes their life easier when it comes to appeal, because it is something that it is more quantifiable, easier to deal with. And when you think about other goals, this is why many times when we have other goals, we try to communicate them in a way that somehow engages with concepts that are familiar to us. So we try to communicate them looking at consumer welfare. We try to quantify them using economic thinking. Now, where one wants to be on that spectrum is a challenging question. For me, there is no doubt that if you go to one end, which is very narrow, you will drive competition law into irrelevance. It will just not address the concerns that we have as a society. It is also clear that if you drive it all the way to the other end and you treat it as a panacea that can basically address any concern that you have, it will not be manageable. We will lose legal certainty. It will not be operational. But somewhere in between, there is this sweet spot where you can have an operational competition law that is also enabling you to address concerns that are relevant to society at a given moment.
Jorge, maybe if you want to reflect upon what Ariel said, and then I'll have a kind of a follow-on question.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, first, I'm very much in agreement with what Ariel is saying. And as I mentioned, ultimately, it is society that needs to decide which goals it wants to achieve and which instruments it wants to use in order to achieve those goals. A word of caution. What is important when you are thinking about what are the goals that competition law should achieve, and before going broad with a broad set of objectives, you need to think carefully as to whether some of the objectives are complementary or contradictory, and try to avoid contradictions, because otherwise, things are not going to work. And secondly, is that if you're planning to broaden the set of objectives that your competition authority needs to achieve, then you need to make sure also that you are providing the resources needed for them to do so. I witness every day at home with my wife how her mandate has been enlarged day after day, to become almost a price controller in many different sectors, to ensure that there is freedom of press, that there is no manipulation, etc., etc. Yet the budget is the same that she had 6 years ago, and by and large, she has the same number of people on whom to rely. And that means that, I think that the efficiency of the organization is compromised, or at least the well-being of those working there and their families is also, affected.
No, that's a very powerful observation, which is hard to challenge, and yet I will try. And I will be referring to measurability and the almost syllogistic approach to measuring things, which is often associated with maybe old-fashioned consumer welfare metrics, where things have their value, things are ultimately commensurable, and if you are skillful enough, if you're well technically equipped, you can set up this homogeneous set of interests subsumed to the consumer welfare premium goal. But in what we see in practice is that different interpreters on legal side, on economic side, and on specific data-related or knowledge-related areas are capable to build their own story, capable to build their own narrative, and provide their own version of the truth. And thus, the ultimate arbiters are perplexed if they have to discover the more accurate, the more refined theory of consumer welfare, or they have to accept the minimum standard of suitability and then look at what Ariel refer as socio-legal goals. How do you see this?
Is this for me or
For both? Yeah, let's start with you.
Well, consumer welfare is a very broad notion. I mean, consumer welfare it's not just driven by price. It's driven by all factors that impact on an individual's utility. From quality, privacy, the environment, and so on and so forth. I think that unfortunately, consumer welfare has been associated with price exclusively. That is because I think that price is easier to measure. Sometimes it's observable from the market. There is this old dictum that says that economists know the price of everything and the value of nothing. So price is easier to knowledge and grasp than the value of other dimensions. But I am of the view that consumer welfare is much broader, and that oftentimes we have the means and the ability to measure those other dimensions effectively, and therefore define consumer welfare in a broad sense. In fact, I was listening to Ariel before, and Ariel mentioned fairness. Fairness can be brought into a consumer welfare function. I actually believe that the four of us in our utility function, we have fairness embedded, because otherwise we wouldn't do many things that we do, obviously, without any compensation and just for the common good. So I think that many times the issue is not so much whether we use consumer welfare as our reference or not, is how willing we are to do and take the effort to make sure that we implement consumer welfare functions that are more realistic and better reflective of what real individuals care about, as opposed to the kind of stereotypical homo economicus that only cares about silver and gold.
So how would that work in practice, especially in a public enforcement setting? So would the limit of consumer welfare would be essentially the limit of good or convincing economic evidence that the defendant or undertakings can bring?
So let me start by referring a little bit to what Jorge has said, and I think what we probably all agree is that economics is not a value-free discipline. So when we speak about consumer welfare, there are different shades of consumer welfare, and some people might take a wider perspective than others. And Jorge mentions fairness, which implies distribution, which implies a certain appreciation of values and norms that are very European, something that we really care deeply about. And you can easily imagine economists elsewhere who would put less emphasis on distribution of wealth, less emphasis on the nature of interactions on the market, and would favor something which is much more narrow in nature. And I think what it means is that the perception of purity that we sometimes have when we speak about economics is really misleading, because there is a lot of flexibility even within economics. What are the paradigms that you rely on? What are your best assumptions? And how do you measure different variables that reflect a lot of the things that we speak about from a legal perspective? And once you accept that, what it does help you appreciate is that there isn't a single point of application of competition law which represents the purity of, well, that is competition law and everything else is somehow tainted with, social or industrial values. Because even a decision to take it to the narrowest form and just focus on, let's say, efficiency, that in itself is a policy decision where what you say is, this is what I believe in. That's the only thing that matters. I believe that what counts is only what is countable. That is a policy decision. It's not a pure decision, but we evolved to reflect on it in a way that the narrower something is, the purer it is. And I think that is just misleading. It doesn't reflect reality, but it does create a sense of purity, and you do see it. People that usually represent a very, very narrow approach to what antitrust is about benefit from the sense that because they can measure it, then this is it. As a society, this is not what we're about. Competition law is not about that. It also isn't about having everything uploaded onto this framework of competition law, but it is somewhere in between. And I think we're all actually pretty close in our appreciation, which is, I think, a European approach to some extent, that competition law cannot be minimalized, but it also cannot encompass just everything. It is somewhere in between. And of course, we will have different views on where each of us will position ourselves.
But let me still insist. So even if we accept this framework, and I think probably all of us and many other across Europe would agree, how would that work? What would be the limits? What would be outside of competition law, and how would that work?
So let me address that question, but also following up from what Ariel was mentioning before. So there are different societies with different views as to, for example, distribution. So in Europe, we do care about distribution, and I think that, again, I'm pretty sure that the four of us have distribution in our utility function. Some other societies care much less about distribution. Now, even if you care about distribution, then the question that you can ask is, okay, but how are we going to achieve distribution? What instruments we are going to use to achieve distribution? Now, in Europe, we have a relatively effective distribution system through taxation. We have progressive direct taxation. In some countries like mine, you also have a wealth tax, and that helps you, the combination of our fiscal policy in terms of taxes, but also in the way in which we spend money, which is, involves some positive discrimination in favor of those that have less resources, then you can achieve a degree of distribution. Then the question is, do I need other instruments to achieve even more distribution or not? Or can I restrict then other policy instruments to maximize the size of the pie, so that then with my fiscal policy, I achieve the optimal distribution? My view is that in the case of many European countries, competition law can be more restricted to maximize the size of the pie, because we can achieve distribution through other means. Curiously enough, I would think that competition law should be perhaps more open to distribution in countries or in societies like the US, where perhaps distribution through taxation is less common. I remember once spending some time in South Africa, and in South Africa, they were telling me, okay, one of the objectives of competition law is actually the empowerment of the majority that has been discriminated over the years, before Mandela and the end of the apartheid system. And this is part of competition law. And reflecting upon that, I actually understood that it had a logic, because competition law is also about, in a sense, impinges on property, is a limitation of property law, on property rights. And it is a way in which you can achieve redistribution of property. And given the absence of other instruments to redistribute property, it had a logic. So all that I'm saying, I guess, is that you need to think about what are the ultimate objectives, But then you need to think about what is the set of instruments that you have, and perhaps you need to be broader in what the tasks that you allocate to competition law when you lack some other instruments, and you can afford being narrower when other instruments can complement what you can achieve and the goals of society.
I want to, so I agree with what you say, but it just makes me realize that maybe it's worth nuancing something. When we speak about distribution from within competition law, so I'm not thinking about trying to imitate the tax system. We actually had a project on economic inequality and competition. What is the role that competition law could play when it comes to economic inequality? And you can take two approaches. One is to argue that this is one of the goals of competition law, and that definitely complicates things. The other is to appreciate that through competition law, through the process of rivalry, you can have positive impact on distribution of wealth. But when we speak about fairness and distribution, what we think about, for instance, is the ability of a dominant company to extract rents from others. So I'm thinking of it much more in line with mainstream economic analysis. So this is point one. Point two, about our other systems that are there, I think, and this is irrelevant to our discussion, but it is relevant to just appreciate that our other systems that are about redistribution are generally not delivering much in many jurisdictions, because economic inequality is a real problem. And that should just emphasize why competition law is so crucial, but also competition law that is trying to make sure that there is an element of fairness. And then to take it to Or's question, then I think for the court, in question of what can the court do, the court operates within a framework that is the case law, the law, the goals that are set. And it is heavily influenced, of course, by the input. I mean, whatever are the cases that reach the judge. But I think that what happens is that the court also finds comfort in trying to go to areas that are measurable. And you see it in many judgments. Judges, you would argue, often know less than the competition agencies. So this is why they use expert evidence. This is why they rely heavily on economists. This is why they ask the lawyers to formulate a story of harm that they can appreciate and acknowledge. And in those stories, you see, in most cases, judges tend to be rather traditional. Now, you will find in a lot of cases references to values that some people will find a bit wide. And I think it's always important when you review a judgment to try and ascertain, first of all, what is the decisive argument that led to a decision one way or another. Usually, it will be something very close to the core DNA of what competition law is about. It will be about consumer welfare, it will be about efficiencies, it will be about the core of competition law. Once you have that, often judges and sometimes competition agencies will pepper the decision with some additional values. They will say this also impacts plurality. This also has a significant effect on something else, fairness. They might even refer to economic elements that on their own would not carry a decision. Many times when you refer to buyer power, it is something that is bolted into something, but on its own, it might not necessarily. There aren't that many decisions when this would be the driving force. So in reality, even when we have competition law that is relatively wide, I think the reality is that the decisive elements tend to be very much in the comfort zone of economic analysis. It is not often that you will find that courts feel very comfortable to move beyond that. Now, you might agree with it or disagree, and you might think that they should. I think in reality, for something to be filtered into the analysis, it will need to be quantified, because otherwise it is just immensely challenging for judges to cope with it. So in a way, the prism, the workable prism remains economics. And if you look even at statements, populist statements, let's say, from commissioners, from competition officials, when they refer, because we mentioned fairness, it's fairness is a lovely area to explore this relationship. Repeatedly, fairness is, and we contrast that in comparison to the early days of European competition law, where fairness was an intervention benchmark. But in modern competition law, fairness is always positioned as a norm, as a value, but not as a theory of harm. And it is true that some anti-competitive activities are also unfair, and it is true that fairness colors our approach to what is acceptable and what is not, but we do not target fairness as a leading benchmark for intervention. And I think that tells you a lot about the discipline that we have. It is a discipline with a core DNA and a lot of values that influence the way that we approach that core.
This sounds very convincing. Jorge, let me ask the next question, and then if you will connect it with what Ariel just said, or maybe start, because this is a related question. Namely, we've been talking about the internal dimension of competition law and policy and economics, and now we look at propose to look at the external one, interaction of competition agencies with national governments, where the traditional two-dimensional reality was somehow we have the secret answer and it has to be isolated, insulated from any political impact because it blurs the clarity of our formulaic syllogistic discovery procedure where we try to discover the truth. Now we somehow, or many of us, start questioning it, or at least we say that things are not monosemic but polysemic somehow. Things are interpretable, and thus maybe it would not be a bug of the system where competition agencies have communication protocols with the government, not in vulgaris form where you expose yourself to operational independence, but somehow knowing what is the steering role, what should be, what is on the agenda for this society, a democratically elected society. I remember you referring to this point at another event. So let us maybe start from looking at this quite problematic issue of interaction between competition authorities and central government, be it within member states or the European Union itself, the GCOMP and the Commission in college.
Right. So I think that when we talk about the independency of the competition agencies, I think that there is a proposition that I think that it is commonly agreed and cannot be questioned, which is the competition agencies have to be independent from the regulated companies. So they have to act in complete independence or with complete independence of the people that are going to be regulated, the dominant companies, the merging parties, and so on. The question is, when it becomes, the question of independence becomes interesting, is whether they should be independent from parliament or from the government. Now, to answer that question, let us think a little bit about another type of agency, the central bank. Because in a sense, that's where I think that we economists developed a better model of independence and what it means. The central banks are independent. Monetary policy is delegated to independent agencies because we are concerned about the ability of governments to be intertemporally consistent in the pursuit of their objectives. Meaning, a government can say, I want to make money stable. I want to keep this, and I don't want to debase the currency. And I promise this, but at certain points, it may feel tempted to debase the currency, generating inflation in order to, for example, pay its debts. That's why we have an independent central bank. We have an independent central bank because the government cannot control itself, okay? And in doing so, the government may actually end up hurting itself. Now, let's move to competition agencies. What is the intertemporal inconsistency that we are trying to address with an independent competition agency? Because, like in the case of the central bank, there is no doubt that ultimately The goals are not decided by this independent agency. The goals are decided by the legislature, the citizens, the government. Those are the ones that set the goals. The question is whether there is an inconsistency, an intertemporal inconsistency. That the government says, agency, you should block every single merger that is anti-competitive, but at one point in time, the government may have an incentive not to behave in that particular way. To the best of my understanding, nobody has yet identified that intertemporal inconsistency. It's not like in monetary policy. So the question is, when the government comes and says, do this now, ex post, is it because it has changed its goals? Because if it has changed its goals, it's legitimate. It is legitimized to change the goals. Or is it a temporal inconsistency? So that's why I am a little bit less clear in my mind about the need to preserve at every point in time independence of the government in the case of competition agencies, as opposed to in the case of a central bank.
Ariel? Or
Just to follow on this. So one can argue that this inconsistency, for example, in merger control, could be quite clear. So in the case of national championships or certain mergers that will be allowed to block for industrial policy, wouldn't that be a clear example?
Not clear, because the base in the currency is clearly against the long-term interest of society. It's not clear to me that a departure that moves in the direction of industrial policy is necessarily against long-run consumer welfare. So
But
it's not clear to me.
But it's not, so I agree with you that in terms of change of policy, so if we would actually change what merger control is about, or take a clear stance of the exceptions, then I would completely agree. But here we're talking about more one-off interventions or one-off changes for more of political than policy reasons, if we can draw the line.
And that is the heart of the issue.
Mhm.
The issue is that it is very difficult to identify ex post whether the intervention is driven by good faith change in objectives, or it is an instance of corruption, or it is driven by private gain, political gain, partisan gain. That is the difficulty. However, there is an interesting question, which is, do we think that politicians in government, or politicians in general, are more prone to being corrupted than the heads of the agencies?
I think the underlying assumption is yes.
That's the assumption, but I'm not sure exactly what is the empirical evidence that support that assumption.
let us give the floor on this empirical moment to Ariel.
So I think it's a truly interesting area, because we all sense that there is an increased instrumentalization of competition law. I think there is no doubt that we sense that the purity, the analytical purity of competition law is being threatened. So there are several points that I would like to make. The first one is about agency independence. So everyone accepts that agency independence is crucial. Autonomy of the agency is vital for credibility and systematic analysis. But no one argues that this should result in some sort of isolation. And you have many levers that connect the political arm with the agency, and anyone who works in agencies or with agencies is aware of them. So Jorge mentioned, of course, from the legislation part, but also when you have budgeting and you have appointments and you have steering and you have meetings with the ministers, and you have also public interventions in some jurisdictions. So there is a whole host of formal channels through which the political arm can feed into the decision making of the agency. So that is point one. Point two is that along history, it became clear that technocratic independence is a value. It is something that gives us legal stability, economic stability, predictability, and enables us to operate in a way that competition law can establish itself as a respectable discipline that people can rely on. What has happened in recent years is that due to several processes, the value of technocratic independence has dropped, and there is greater willingness when it comes to politicians to engage in influencing beyond what I described, beyond the legitimate formal paths. And here, there are different ways to conceptualize it. I think one easy way to do it is to think about two categories of intervention. One intervention is when the political arm is concerned about rebalancing the inconsistency between competition enforcement and present industrial policies or social needs, economic needs. And that inconsistency, they believe, is not addressed properly by the competition agency. They, for whatever reason, decided they don't want to use one of the formal channels because they might be politically sensitive or whatever. And then they can intervene, and there are two implementation methods. One would be they intervene overall, affecting the intensity of enforcement, either chilling enforcement or encouraging enforcement, or worse, they intervene on a case-by-case level. And the issue here is that at the very least, the incentives are in line with our goals as a society. So we all appreciate that for us as a society, as a country, we need to somehow rebalance, but they do it in a way that could undermine our little discipline. The second category is a little bit more challenging. This is where you have businesses, individuals, promoting partisan interest, corporate interest, profit motivation. And what they do is, again, try to advance a certain goal to override the analytical integrity of competition law. And they do it through one of the implementation methods, either generally encouraging or discouraging enforcement in a certain area or on a case-by-case level. So you have already, in this kind of very general division, 4 categories of implementation. And the first thing that you see from that is that first we have a heterogeneous landscape. Because when you look now at events around the world, and there are plenty, unfortunately, of things that you would feel uncomfortable with, you can classify them in different rubrics and appreciate that some of them are more problematic from a societal perspective than others. All of them undermine competition law, but at different levels. So when you have intervention that, for instance, is driven by business personal agenda, the problem that you have there is, so this would be one extreme, is that you start to encourage lobbying of a certain type. You start to create expectations by politicians to be involved. You really change and undermine the integrity of competition analysis. If we go to the other end, if what you do is engage in something which is general in nature and is about trying to balance interest of the state, then I think what you have there is something that we feel a bit more comfortable with, because it could even be very close to legitimate intervention. And sometimes the reason that we have concerns about it is the way politicians went about doing this. Overall, I think part of it is the value of independence, technocratic independence that has changed. Part of it is a byproduct of democratic governance that is suffering in recent years, political accountability that enable people to feel a bit more comfortable. The risk that we have when we look at it from our discipline is that we can do or engage in certain measures to try and retain the analytical integrity, but when this is a byproduct of wider political trends, we are limited in our ability to address them. And the second thing is that there is a risk of a domino effect. If you have jurisdictions that in the past championed independence, clarity, and are now being perceived to put less emphasis on these values, then I think it is possible that other jurisdictions would feel less pressurized to adhere to the same standards. So we might see a trend that could be quite problematic for the integrity of competition law.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. And I think that there is value, as Ariel was saying, in technocratic independence. Leaving, once the goals are decided, leaving the agencies to act independently in the implementation of the goals. My only point would be that societies are entitled to change the goals. They should change them through legislation or even soft law, and then the technocrats need to follow. My concern is not to end up with, I'm going to quote Asimov, with robots that in their desire to protect humanity, decide to kill humanity. And that there is no way that you can reprogram them.
This is actually a great segue for my next question, Jorge. So I was wanting to ask you about, so you have a strand of literature about the psychology of competition agencies, and one of the solutions that you put forward is actually robots or the use of computational tools. So can you tell us how you think that would work and why those are not robots in the bad sense?
Yeah, I think that it is meant to address something else, which is that the problem with sometimes technocratic independence is that because the technocrats are humans like all of us, they do what all of us do, which is that they end up persuading themselves that they are the heroes and that the others are the villains. And that means that at some point they end up being less technocratic and more, behavioral, more motivated. Now you need to try to deal with that. One possibility is to make them a little bit less human, so that they are less exposed to motivated reasoning and more objective. Although, frankly, there are lots of doubts as to whether AI is the mean to achieve that, or whether AI ends up being even more biased than the humans. Or another thing is to try to force them to be a little bit less human, which is build within themselves, voices that can criticize them and question them and make them doubt. A little bit like Pinocchio and the little cricket there that is saying, "Are you sure that you're doing the right thing?" Or in the case of the Roman generals, when they were celebrating a triumph, where a slave was placed near to them, telling them, "Remember, you are mortal. Remember, you're mortal." Because in my experience, and this happens in all organizations, it happens within private sector and the public sector, there is a tendency to end up thinking that your way of thinking is the right way of thinking, and anyone that disagrees with you must be evil, capture, or so on. And I think that that's the proposal. So not so much that we go for robots, is that we introduce mechanisms that make us a little bit less human and more open to questioning and criticism.
Ariella, we'll leave it to you, but just if you can, in your answer, so because if I understand from your previous comment, you're not against motivated reasoning. So reasoning that takes into account not just the pure legal test, but also a bit of the surrounding. So what do you think about that? Is that a good thing, or should we limit motivating reasoning?
Yeah, well, so I think we have various elements here that we're discussing, and they're all fascinating. For robots to operate, you need everything to be quantifiable, and that could be a problem. If you have AI, and we're kind of which may enable you to deal with things that are not quantifiable, then the biggest query for you would be, how was the AI trained? What was the human feedback? What are the biases? What is the data? So what we know today is that, of course, there's nothing which is neutral, inherently neutral. So all the tools that we are using can be affected or can be manipulated, depending on what you desire. Two things that, while listening to Jorge's comments, that I agree with. I was thinking about one is that in when we think about humans, the way we try to address this confirmation bias is to create procedures within agencies where you have a case team, but you have then an independent entity that might look at it. And of course, in the UK, the whole panel reform is exactly about that. It is about what is the cost of us maybe moving away from independent panels. And one solution that brings us back to an earlier question would be to look at the courts and the role the courts could play in providing some sort of a balancing effect and trying to break maybe elements of confirmation bias or trying to inject some further independence. And a second very short comment, I think we all know that power corrupts. It corrupts in politics, it corrupts in business. It can also corrupt when you have an agency, not just competition law, that has too much power and there are no checks and balances. So when we design our frameworks, our systems as a society, one of the key things that we always have to make sure is that we have checks and balances. We should never rely even on the most humane and noble enforcer at a given moment, because what we need to do is design systems that could also withstand people that are less noble. And for that reason, more checks and balances, more balanced system is something that we should all aspire to.
This is amazing. We so enjoy this conversation, Oren and myself. We hope we will continue at some point in the future within this format. But now let us move to the questions which you may have for each other, starting with you, Jorge.
So my question to Ariel is the following. It's almost a question and almost a proposal to keep thinking together about this. You mentioned fairness, and I think that fairness as a value is a legitimate value. But you also mentioned that courts and societies tend to feel comfortable when you have the ability to measure, and that notions that are not measurable tend to be downplayed. So how do we make fairness measurable? Can we try to do that? Can we, for example, establish principles that say, look, we are willing to go in the direction of fairness, that we are going to measure in this concrete way to the extent that, for example, they don't sacrifice the size of the pie to a very significant extent? How can we transform fairness from a value to fairness as a measure? And how can we trade fairness against efficiency in ways that they could be comfortable? Do you think that there is hope? And if there is hope, and I always think that humans, the last thing that they should lose is hope, then can we work together?
So I think in the evolution of competition law, fairness has changed its footprint quite significantly. These days, fairness in competition law serves as a norm, serves as something that colors our analysis. And every time someone will mention fairness, they will make clear that this is not about protecting inefficient players. This is not, they will make sure to try and highlight. When I say fairness, I don't mean about protecting inefficiency. What I mean is a certain value. What I mean is something that reflects a certain ethos. Actually, looking at the DMA gives you a possibility to start developing the concept, because the concept is often referred to, but has not developed in terms of analytically. So when you look at contestability, the relationship between contestability and fairness, the idea that fairness is linked to what we would refer to as anti-competitive activities, exclusionary practices, leveraging time. But the ethos is what you're doing is unfair because you're affecting. So I think we are many times communicating fairness by using things that are quite analytical, but there is a whole portion of the value of fairness that I agree with you. It's very difficult to communicate. And what it is used for is mostly to help people appreciate what competition law is about. People react much better to the idea of fairness than competition. This is why, if you look at the Austrian, the Germans, the slogans of the agencies are more competition, fairer economy. So we're using this because whereas for us, we appreciate what competition brings and the fairness it brings with it. I think it is slightly less accessible when you think about society as a whole.
And your question, Ariel, to Jorge.
So, so what I would like to ask Jorge is whether you think competition law, and more specifically antitrust economics, delivered on the promise. When you look at our markets today, the state of the economy, do you think that our discipline actually delivered on the promise? Because we're all, overworked. There seem to be more inequality. There seems to be quite a lot of things that are inconsistent with the promise, the general promise of competition. So I wonder how you feel about it. Do you believe that we have delivered on the promise of competitive markets?
Well, my view, let's define it against a counterfactual without competition agencies. I think that competition agencies have contributed positively. Now, why am I saying so? Well, look at, for example, anti-cartel activity. I think that cartels are much less likely today than they were 30 years ago. If I look at the Spanish economy, for example, it's much less cartelized. Still, there are cartels, but it's much less cartelized than they used to be. And you can see that in the way that, for example, in many sectors, changes in cost are passed through prices, etc. Many sectors of the economy, telecoms, energy, have benefited significantly from the combined actions of regulators, national competition agencies, and the European Commission. And I think that consumers have benefited tremendously as a result of that. But at the same time, competition law and competition agencies can affect the economy to a certain extent. There are many other factors that affect the economy to a larger extent. I think that if you look at inequality, my view personally is that market power may have had an impact, but very limited. I think that trade has been much more important, the effects of globalization and the lack of countervailing measures to limit the distributional aspects of globalization, and then technology. I think that, if anything, technology is the fundamental aspect. The challenge now for competition agencies is, to me, is not so much that they guarantee the markets work well in a static sense, but unfortunately, I think that that's where they are putting their minds to. I think that the challenge is that they, ensure that the legitimacy of our system, of our capitalist system, is maintained, and that requires to make sure that there is entry and exit, that you keep the freedom of entry and exit, that whoever wants to be an entrepreneur tomorrow has a chance if he has a brilliant idea. That's a very demanding objective, but that's where I think that they should focus. And so, to conclude and to link it to the very first question, I think that agencies have done relatively well in the past in maximizing static consumer welfare. The big challenge that they have now is to make sure that they do well in maximizing long-run consumer welfare. Many of your distributional issues go there. Many of what I would say the promotion of entrepreneurship that I have in mind goes there. It's much more difficult, it's not impossible. And look, with the help of the new tools, we may be a little bit more daring in that respect because the scope of quantification has increased tremendously.
Ariel Ezrachi, Jorge Padilla, all Brook and myself are very grateful for sharing your great ideas with us. We hope to be continued.
Thank you so much.